I stepped through the front door of my parents' house, the scent of cinnamon and lemon polish greeting me like a ghost from childhood. The living room looked the same as always, soft beige sofas, family portraits on the walls, and the antique grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. My boots made soft thuds on the hardwood floor as I walked in, my file folder clutched tight against my chest. I had spent weeks fine-tuning my grad school application, letters of recommendation, personal statement, transcripts, everything perfect, just like they always expected of me. Mom sat on the couch with a glass of sparkling water, scrolling on her phone like I hadn't just walked into the house after a month away. Dad was in the recliner, remote in hand, watching a muted newscast on TV. I got in, I said, a smile breaking across my face. Adams School of Policy. Full acceptance, and if I can get everything in by next week, I'm eligible for a merit-based grant, too. They barely reacted. That's nice, Mom said, without looking up. I blinked, stunned into silence for a second, then continued, trying not to let the awkwardness crack the moment. I'm going to need the college fund, though. The grant won't cover housing and the first semester's upfront costs. I called the bank and they said the trust account is still under your names. Mom's eyes finally lifted from her phone, and I caught the flicker, hesitation, maybe guilt, maybe just discomfort at being pulled out of her digital haze. Dad cleared his throat and leaned forward, setting the remote on the coffee table. Oh, Mom said, like I'd asked if we still had milk in the fridge. That money's gone. My breath stopped. Gone. She nodded, her tone maddeningly casual. We used it last year. For Mason's house. That down payment in Maplebrook? That was from the fund. I stared at her, sure I had misheard. What are you talking about? Your grandparents wanted to help the family. Mason was in a tough spot, and it was a great investment, she said, swirling the glass in her hand like this was a normal conversation. You'll be fine. You've always been resourceful. I looked at Dad. You let this happen? He sighed like this conversation bored him. You're smart, Cass. You'll figure it out. Loans exist for a reason. A roaring silence filled my ears. My fingers went numb around the folder. That was my money, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Grandpa Warren and Grandma Judith left it for me. For school. They told me themselves. They said they wanted to give me a future. They didn't say it had to be just for you, Mom snapped, finally showing a spark of annoyance. You're not a child anymore, Cassidy. Mason's starting a family. He needed a boost. My mouth opened, then closed again. No words could shape the fury and disbelief tearing through my chest. You gave away $130,000 of my future without even asking me? It was a family decision, Dad muttered, leaning back. No, I said, louder this time, my voice shaking. It was theft. You stole from me. Mom rolled her eyes and stood, brushing invisible lint from her slacks. Don't be dramatic. Dramatic? I let the folder slip from my fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. The papers scattered, the edges catching a breeze from the nearby vent. All that work, all that hope, undone in one casual betrayal. Mason. Of course it was Mason. The golden boy with the two-time college dropout record, who never held a job for more than a year without some convenient excuse. The one who crashed Dad's truck and got a new one the next week. Who once failed a class and got a pizza party because he tried his best. And I, who graduated early, who worked nights at the bookstore to help with bills, who never asked for anything, was now being told to take out loans because my family had deemed me less worthy. I crouched and gathered my papers, my hands shaking. Mom said something about dinner, asked if I wanted to stay. I didn't respond. As I stood, I looked at them, really looked at them. These weren't the same people who helped me build science fair models in 4th grade or cheered when I won the regional writing contest in middle school. Or maybe they were, and I had just been too eager for love to notice how conditional it all was. I cleared my throat. You know what? I said, forcing calm into every syllable. I'm not staying. I came here expecting support, not betrayal. You're overreacting, Dad muttered, picking up the remote again. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say to people who didn't see me as worth protecting. I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the knob. "I hope Mason enjoys his dream home," I said without turning around. "But I'm done playing second to his messes. Don't expect me to clean this one up." And then I walked out. The wind had picked up, tossing early autumn leaves across the driveway. My car sat there like a lifeline. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat with my hands on the wheel, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. I wasn't just driving away from their house, I was driving away from the belief that they would ever truly see me. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. Not even close. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment bed, staring up at the ceiling as shadows shifted across the room, playing tricks on the walls. My mind was too loud, my thoughts circling like hawks over a kill, dipping lower each time, never letting me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Darlene, with her frosted lipstick smile and blank indifference. Glenn, detached, unbothered, flipping channels like my dreams weren't bleeding out on their living room floor. But more than them, I saw Warren and Judith. My grandparents. The quiet anchors of my childhood. I reached over to my nightstand and pulled out the small photo frame I'd kept there for years. The picture was from a summer afternoon in Pine Hollow. I was maybe 10, barefoot and sunburned, sitting on the porch swing between them. Grandpa Warren's overalls had a fresh tear on the knee, his straw hat tilted back on his head as he laughed. Grandma Judith held a mason jar of iced tea in one hand, her other arm wrapped around me. I remembered that moment vividly. No one else had come with me on that trip. It was just the three of us, and they'd spent the whole weekend listening to me ramble about science camp and the book I was writing about a time-traveling cat. They made me feel like my voice mattered. They believed in me. Warren and Judith were never flashy. They were farmers, the kind who found joy in rain forecasts and early sunrises. They worked their land with the sort of discipline that made me admire them before I even understood what work really was. They didn't talk much about money, but every now and then, they'd say little things. Subtle clues I hadn't pieced together until years later. "College is important," Judith would say, patting my hand. "You've got a mind meant for more, baby girl." Or Warren, nodding while watching me scribble in a notebook on their porch swing, would mumble, "We're saving for you." Quietly. Not a penny wasted. I didn't realize then what that meant. I thought it was something vague and generous, like setting aside $50 here and there for books or birthday gifts. I never imagined they were building a fund, real money, stacked over years, meant to carry me through college and beyond. They never bragged about it, never used it to control or guilt me. They trusted Darlene and Glenn to be stewards of that fund. Not owners, not beneficiaries, just custodians of a promise. That was what crushed me. Not just the money, but the betrayal of that sacred trust. They gave my parents something precious and clear, something meant for me, and my parents took it like it was spare change in a junk drawer. Spent it without blinking. On Mason, no less. A man who had never once respected effort or structure. Who laughed at rules and consequences. Who coasted while I climbed. I sat up, pushing the covers off. The apartment was dark except for the dim glow from the streetlight outside. I padded into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The cold of the tile seeped into my bare feet, grounding me. I couldn't let this go. I wouldn't let this go. I opened the drawer by the fridge and pulled out the manila envelope I'd stuffed in there last month. Inside were some of Grandma Judith's old letters, recipes, and a few papers she'd mailed me just before she died. I flipped through them until I found the bank statement she'd included once, with a little note scribbled at the top, "You'll need this someday. Always keep your records." The statement showed a savings account under Cassidy L. Lane, custodians Darlene and Glenn Lane. Balance, $130,297. I stared at that number until my eyes blurred. The date on it was 8 months before Judith passed. She must have known. Or suspected. Maybe she'd feared what might happen if she didn't put it in writing. That wasn't just a number. It was sweat. It was sacrifice. They'd spent decades growing vegetables and tending livestock. Judith worked 2 days a week as a librarian in town. Warren sold firewood in the winters. Every dollar was earned, not handed down. And they chose to give it to me because they saw something worth investing in. Not because I asked, but because I worked and dreamed and loved learning with a passion they recognized. And now it was gone. I leaned my head against the cabinet door and closed my eyes. I could almost hear Judith's voice. Soft but firm. Don't let people walk off with your future, Cassidy. If you don't fight for it, they'll think it never mattered. I clutched the envelope to my chest and let the silence settle in. The pain was raw, like an exposed nerve, but beneath it, something else had begun to stir. Not rage, not grief, those had already passed through. No, this was something sharper, more precise. Clarity. My parents hadn't just mishandled money. They'd desecrated a legacy. Taken something built on love and patience and turned it into a favor for their favorite child. They thought I'd swallow it. Move on. Take out loans. Forgive and forget. But that wasn't going to happen. Not this time. I walked back to my room, turned on my desk lamp, and opened my laptop. I started compiling everything, emails from Mason bragging about his new place, the letter Judith had sent with the bank statement, even texts from Mom mentioning the fund when I was an undergrad. I created folders, screenshots, PDFs. If I was going to fight for what was mine, I needed a trail. By the time the sun began to rise, bleeding pink and gold into the sky, I had 3 folders and a working timeline. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it. But I knew this. I wasn't going to be silent. I wasn't going to let their theft become my burden. Warren and Judith didn't build that fund for me to bury it with my dignity. They built it because they believed I was worth something. And I was about to prove they were right. I was 8 the first time I noticed the imbalance. Mason had just flunked a math test, barely wrote his name at the top, but when he came home that afternoon, there was a brand new mountain bike waiting for him in the driveway. Red, with shiny silver spokes and thick tires that made mine look like a hand-me-down from a garage sale. I had gotten straight A's on my report card the week before. My reward? A pat on the head and a good job muttered over a sink full of dishes. That moment lived inside me like a bruise no one could see. Mason was the sun around which our family orbited. His failures were brushed off with chuckles. He's just figuring himself out, Mom would say, as if chronic underachievement was an act of self-discovery. When he barely graduated high school, there was a celebration in our backyard with banners and catered food. When I graduated 2 years later, early, with honors, I got a rush dinner at Applebee's and a slice of pie we shared in the car. Ashbury Heights was a manicured suburb with perfect lawns and PDA potlucks, and in that world, Mason was everyone's golden boy. He had that kind of lopsided charm that made teachers roll their eyes fondly and neighbors greet him like royalty. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one. The reader. The girl who volunteered at the library and corrected grammar in group chats. I didn't sparkle, I shone in a way that made people squint. As I got older, the gap only widened. Mason bounced between colleges like they were weekend plans. First it was pre-law, then business administration, and finally, he half-heartedly tried urban planning before dropping out for good. Each time he gave up, my parents found a way to cushion the fall, another trip, another excuse. School's not for everyone, Dad would say, turning the page of his newspaper. He's just trying to find his passion, Mom would add, like that explained why he'd blown through 2 scholarships and still couldn't hold a job longer than a fiscal quarter. Meanwhile, I was balancing AP classes, tutoring 3 nights a week, and working part-time at the neighborhood bookstore so I could save up for college textbooks. I never asked for much. I knew not to. It was like I learned early on that my success was an inconvenience. It reminded them that Mason's wasn't real. And still, I believed in that college fund. Even when I found out Mason had been given a small loan to get out of credit card debt, or when they replaced his car after his 3rd accident in 2 years, I still believed. Because that fund wasn't just money. It was sacred. It was the only promise they ever made that felt like it was actually for me. Warren and Judith had whispered about it when I was 12. They'd driven down from Pine Hollow in their old Buick and stayed for my school play. Judith pulled me aside afterward and handed me a little folded napkin with a note on it, "For your future, Cassidy." Quiet savings. We're trusting your folks to keep it safe until the time's right. I still have that napkin. Back then, I didn't fully grasp what it meant. But as the years passed, I started asking, subtly, carefully, is that college fund still there? Did Grandpa and Grandma's savings make it to the bank? I'd get vague assurances. Of course it's there, Mom would say. Don't worry about it. So I didn't. Even when I felt the walls closing in. When I had to skip out on a campus internship because I couldn't afford the unpaid hours. When I declined out-of-state scholarships because rent was too high and they refused to help. I swallowed my frustration and told myself, just wait. That fund is for grad school. That's when it'll count. But now I know the truth. It had never counted. Not really. Not for me. Mason got the house in Maplebrook, the one with the wraparound porch and the guest suite, the kind of place people in our family only ever dreamed of owning. He moved in with Jenna, who now posted carefully curated photos of the new kitchen and their matching coffee mugs. They were planning a nursery. And the housewarming party? Darlene had beamed in every photo, glass of rose in hand, as if she'd built the damn place brick by brick. And me? I was supposed to smile, nod, and saddle myself with student loans for a degree they had encouraged me to pursue since I was old enough to spell policy. Loans exist for a reason, Dad had said. Sure. So do choices. And they had made theirs. All those years of being second place, they were never accidents. Never the result of forgetfulness or distraction. It was always a choice. A pattern. I was useful when I could make them look good. When I could be the proof that they raised a smart kid. But when I needed something back. When I reached for the one thing that had been promised to me, again and again, in whispers and smiles and napkin notes. They'd already given it to Mason. I looked around my apartment, the tiny studio I'd crammed with books and used furniture. My desk was cluttered with folders and notes from a dozen late-night study sessions. On the wall was a corkboard I'd filled with color-coded plans, application deadlines, policy conference dates, essay goals. Every square inch of that board had been built on the belief that I had something solid waiting behind me. A parachute. A safety net. Turns out, it had been ripped out from under me while I was still midair. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The welcome screen blinked at me, and for a moment I just stared. Then I opened my personal statement draft. All those words about resilience, about leadership and determination, suddenly felt different. Not dishonest, just heavier. More earned. I highlighted a sentence near the end and rewrote it. My family has always supported my education became. Even when support failed, I kept building. And then I let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my ribs for years. No more waiting for them to see me. No more believing that doing everything right would earn me a place at the table. They could keep their table. Hell, they could choke on it. I'd build my own. And this time, I'd make damn sure no one took it from me. I went back one more time. Not because I wanted to forgive them, or because I thought for one delusional second that they'd changed their minds. I went back because I needed to see it, needed to look into their eyes and confirm what my gut had already told me. That it wasn't a misunderstanding. That it wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment. That it was betrayal, full and unflinching. Deliberate. The air was heavier this time, like even the house knew something had shifted. The same soft jazz floated from the kitchen speakers, the same vanilla candle flickered on the hallway table, but it all felt artificial, like I'd stepped onto a film set mimicking home. Darlene was arranging tulips in a vase when I walked in. She looked up, surprised but not concerned, like she hadn't shattered my future a few days earlier with the same casual tone she used when reminding me to take my shoes off. "You're back," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Want some tea?" I ignored the question. "We need to talk. All of us." She opened her mouth to protest, but I was already walking toward the living room. Glenn was in his usual spot, recliner, remote in hand, staring at a muted fishing show. When I stepped in front of the TV, he sighed like I was the inconvenience. Darlene followed, resting her hands on the back of the sofa. "Cassidy, if this is about." "It's exactly about that," I said, cutting her off. "And you're going to sit down and listen for once." There was a pause. A beat of silence that felt like the moment before thunder cracks the sky open. Glenn leaned back slowly, arms crossed. Darlene perched on the edge of the couch like a queen tolerating a servant's request. I stayed standing. I wanted them to look up at me for once. I spent the last few days thinking maybe I misunderstood. I began, voice steady. Maybe I didn't hear it right. Maybe the money hadn't really been touched, or there was some legal restriction, or, God, I don't know, some legitimate reason you'd taken my college fund and given it to Mason. I laughed bitterly under my breath. But there wasn't. You just did it. No conversation. No warning. You gave away my future like it was an old casserole in the fridge you didn't want anymore. Darlene opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. I'm not done. I turned to Glenn. You told me loans exist for a reason. That I'd bounce back. You think that's comforting? You think it's easy to come up with $130,000 of debt and still stay afloat in a world like this? I put in decades of work to earn their trust, I continued. Warren and Judith knew I had goals. They saw the way I studied, the way I worked to make something of myself. They chose me, and you two treated that choice like a gift certificate you could re-gift to your favorite child. That landed. Darlene's jaw tightened. Glenn finally set the remote down. Mason needs stability, Darlene said slowly, voice cold and tight. He's starting a family. He's had a harder time finding his footing. You're always fine, Cassidy. You land on your feet. That's who you are. That was it. That was the excuse. Because I was capable, I didn't deserve help. Because I made things work, they gave what little they had to the one who didn't. As if my competence had made me less worthy of care. You didn't help me because I didn't scream, I said. Because I didn't make a mess of my life and wait for you to clean it up. Darlene folded her arms, clearly done with the conversation. You're making this into a war, Cassidy. Families help each other. Families don't steal from each other, I snapped. You didn't help Mason with your own money. You used mine. You didn't even ask. It's done, Glenn said flatly. You can't undo it. We're not arguing about this forever. No, I said, backing toward the door. You're right. We're not. Because I wasn't arguing anymore. I was finished explaining why I mattered. Finished making a case for my worth in the courtroom of my own family. Darlene lifted her chin. Don't make a scene. I laughed, low, humorless. Scene? This was the calm. You'll know when the storm comes. I turned, walked to the front door, and opened it wide. The wind caught the edge of my coat, flaring it out like wings. For the first time in days, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel helpless. I felt lit from within. Because I wasn't just walking away from their choices, I was walking toward mine. I stepped onto the porch and looked back only once. They were frozen in the entryway, framed by their perfect suburban home, the facade crumbling around them in slow motion. They thought I'd stay silent. That I'd swallow the betrayal, take the loans, maybe cry a little, and then keep playing the role I'd always played, the quiet daughter who never asked for too much. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I got in my car and sat for a long minute, staring out at the cul-de-sac I used to bike around as a kid. Everything looked the same, but I wasn't. Something had shifted inside me, something irreversible. A flame that no amount of their cold indifference could put out. This wasn't about getting the money back anymore. It was about reclaiming what they tried to erase. My voice, my future, my right to be seen. I pulled out of the driveway without another glance. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me. A number I hadn't dialed in years flashed across the screen. Roy Kramer. I stared at it, then reached over and answered. Cassidy Lane, a gravelly voice said. I heard what happened. You ready to make it right? I looked out at the road ahead. Open, unforgiving, full of possibility. Yeah, I said. I'm ready. I hadn't heard from Roy Kramer in over a decade. The last time I'd seen him, I was 16 and sitting across the Thanksgiving table while he and my mother argued about politics and pork roast. He was loud, stubborn, and sharper than a scalpel. Darlene had always called him Roy the Rottweiler, though not to his face. He didn't flinch at confrontation, and unlike most of the Lane family, he didn't believe in sweeping things under a rug just to keep the peace. Maybe that's why my grandparents trusted him once, and why they eventually stopped talking to him. But that voice on the phone? It was like steel wrapped in sandpaper. Direct. No nonsense. And, for the first time in weeks, comforting. I drove across town to meet him at his house, a single-story brick ranch tucked behind a cluster of overgrown hedges on the edge of Westridge. The place looked like it hadn't changed since 1985, down to the wind chimes and a faded "N.O. Solicitors" sign on the front door. Roy answered before I could knock. He looked older, but not softer. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, though lined with age, were alert. Calculating. "Well," he said, stepping back to let me in, "you look like hell." I almost laughed. "Thanks. You look exactly the same." His lips twitched, something between a smirk and a shrug. The inside of his house smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lemon wood polish. Books and legal files were stacked on nearly every surface. I followed him into a small den where a pot of coffee was already brewing. He poured me a mug, no cream, no sugar, just like Grandpa Warren used to do. "You didn't waste time calling me," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug. Roy dropped into his armchair and laced his fingers behind his head. "I got wind of what your folks pulled. You should have called sooner. I didn't know who else would believe me." He snorted. "Cassidy, I've been waiting for something like this since 2004. I blinked. "Seriously?" Roy leaned forward and grabbed a yellowed folder from the table. "I warned Warren and Judith back then, don't leave the fund under Darlene's control. She always had a thing for shortcuts. Thought she could outsmart systems she didn't even understand." He opened the folder and pulled out a document. "Your grandparents wanted that money protected. They trusted your parents because they thought family meant accountability. Turns out," I muttered, "it doesn't." Roy tapped the paper. "This is a copy of the original education trust. I had one stashed away from when I helped Warren draw it up. See that?" He pointed to a clause highlighted in faded blue ink. "The fund was intended for your post-secondary education only, and under no condition was it to be redirected without legal consultation and the beneficiary's written consent." I stared at it. A tightness clamped around my chest. "So they broke the law?" "They broke at least 3, Roy said. Breach of fiduciary duty, inheritance mismanagement, and fraudulent transfer of funds." He reached into another folder and tossed out a few business cards, names printed in bold, sharp fonts. "I've already contacted a forensic accountant. Old friend from my auditing days. She's itching for a puzzle like this. Got a retired federal investigator and an estate attorney lined up too. People who still believe in consequences." I was stunned into silence. "You really pulled all this together already?" He raised an eyebrow. "Cassidy, I don't move slow when family lines get crossed. You're Warren and Judith's legacy. You think I'm letting Darlene and Glenn soil that?" Emotion hit me in waves: relief, disbelief, and something else I hadn't felt in weeks: resolve. Roy saw it. "I'm not doing this for pity, kid. I'm doing it because it's the right thing. And because I hate being right about people like your mother." I couldn't help but laugh, a short, unsteady thing. "You really haven't changed." "Nope." We spent the next 3 hours laying groundwork. Roy handed me a list of documents to track down: bank statements, text messages, emails, even the napkin Judith had once scrawled her note on. He said everything mattered. Every shred of paper could help stitch together a timeline of intent and deception. "You're the key witness," he told me. "Your testimony, your records, those will anchor the whole case. But we'll need more. We'll dig through every transaction your parents made in the last 5 years. Trust me, money leaves a trail." "What about Mason?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Roy's smile was grim. "If that house was purchased using your fund, and if he knew, or should have known, that the money didn't belong to your parents, he's liable too. Especially if the purchase involved falsified documentation. Which, knowing Glenn, it probably did." The thought of Mason squirming under the weight of his crumbling castle should have felt vindicating. But it didn't. Not yet. "What happens if we win?" I asked quietly. "You get your money back," Roy said. "With interest. And your parents will have to answer for what they did. In court. In front of a judge." I exhaled slowly. And what if we lose? Roy's eyes locked on mine. We don't lose. Not with the truth on our side. It wasn't bravado. It was certainty. The kind that made me believe, even when I didn't want to. By the time I left his house, the sun had set and the first hint of winter clung to the air. I slid into my car, my hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, but my spine straighter than it had been in weeks. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for the truth, my truth. The truth my grandparents trusted me to carry forward. And now I wasn't alone. Roy was right. They made their choices. They played favorites. They gambled my future away on Mason's mistakes. But now it was my turn to make a move. And I wasn't playing nice anymore. There's something eerie about looking at numbers on a page and knowing they're proof of betrayal. Cold, methodical, impossible to argue with. I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop open, eyes scanning the digital files Roy's team had uncovered over the last week. Dozens of spreadsheets, financial statements, wire transfers, line after line of data that laid bare everything my parents had done. It had started small. Quiet withdrawals from Grandma Judith's accounts, some as early as 6 months before she passed. $3,000 here, $5,200 there, always labeled as home improvements or family medical needs. Then came larger transfers. One for $25,000 marked as relocation expenses, another for $15,000 with no explanation at all. And then the big one. The lump sum $130,000 transferred from the education trust account in my name into a joint checking account belonging to Darlene and Glenn Lane. 3 days later, a cashier's check was issued to a real estate agency in Maplebrook. The date burned into my vision, June 3rd. Just 4 weeks after I had submitted my initial grad school applications, buzzing with hope, thinking I had a plan. I sat back, the chair creaking beneath me, and rubbed my hands over my face. I wanted to scream, but no amount of yelling could drown out the silence of their decisions. The sheer deliberateness of it all. This wasn't a slip. It wasn't desperation. It was calculated. Roy's forensic accountant, Gwen, had laid it all out in a clean, brutal summary. Your parents disguised the use of your inheritance by routing the money through shared accounts and labeling it under vague family expenses. When they applied for Mason's mortgage, they listed the education fund as a family contribution, deliberately omitting your name. That's fraud, Cassidy. The word still rang like a fire alarm in my head. Fraud. They used me. My identity, my trust, my future, folded it into Mason's dream home like it was just another building block in his never-ending tower of second chances. Gwen had also flagged something else. An email exchange between Glenn and the mortgage officer at Bridgemont Bank. It was brief, but damning. Glenn assured the officer that the family contribution funds were freely given for our son's advancement. No documentation for me. No signed release. Just his word. And that word had been enough to unlock the door for Mason. I stood and started pacing the living room, trying to release the energy that vibrated beneath my skin. Every wall in my apartment felt too close, every breath too shallow. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Roy. Ready for the next step? He asked. Define ready, I replied, half laughing. Gwen's compiled the full financial timeline. And Evan, our estate attorney, has drafted a formal complaint. We can file by the end of the week. I want you to review everything first. Okay, I said, swallowing. What happens once we file? There'll be a preliminary hearing. Your parents will be notified and have a chance to respond. But with the evidence we've got, they'll be on the defensive from the start. I exhaled, sitting back down. And Mason? If he knew the money wasn't theirs to give, he could be pulled into this legally. Especially if he signed off on documents referencing false information. At the very least, Bridgemont Bank may initiate their own investigation. I rested my elbows on the table and held my head in my hands. It was all happening so fast, and yet it felt like I'd been living in this storm for years. You okay, kid? Roy asked after a pause. I'm getting there, I said. It's just seeing it all like this. It's like watching my childhood unravel in Excel rows and legal jargon. Roy's voice softened. I get it. But this isn't just about money anymore. It's about truth. And they don't get to rewrite it because it's inconvenient. After the call, I opened the summary packet Gwen had prepared. Every page was meticulous, filled with notes and diagrams. I read the whole thing, line by line, until my eyes burned. I saw my grandparents' names over and over, Warren and Judith Lane, referenced in account transfers, trust documents, and emails. Each instance felt like a whisper from the past, like they were standing behind me saying, "We knew this might happen. We hoped it wouldn't. But we're here." I closed the file and reached for the small wooden box I kept on the bookshelf. Inside were a few mementos, my first library card, a bookmark Judith had embroidered, and a folded letter from Warren I'd never read until after his funeral. I opened it now, letting the paper unfold slowly. His handwriting was shaky but familiar. "Cassidy, you have a good head on your shoulders and a heart that won't be bent by the world unless you let it. People will try to take shortcuts. They'll cheat. They'll smile while they do it. But you keep walking straight. You keep building what you believe in. The rest will catch up. Love you always, kiddo. Keep your light. Grandpa Warren." I pressed the letter to my chest and let the tears come, not because I was broken, but because I was tired of pretending this didn't matter. It mattered. It all mattered. And now I had the truth to prove it. Later that night, I emailed Roy, confirming that I approved the complaint. We were moving forward. No more waiting. No more silence. Let them receive those documents. Let them feel the weight of what they'd done, not just in principle, but in consequence. They thought I'd be too quiet, too polite, too conditioned by years of being second place to push back. They thought wrong. This time, I had the paper trail. And this time, I was following it all the way to justice. The first crack came as a whisper, an email forwarded to me by Roy from someone at Bridgemont Bank. No subject line, just a single sentence buried in the body of a forwarded message: "Mortgage review in progress. Hold on disbursements until cleared by compliance." I read it 3 times before the meaning really hit. Mason's house wasn't just a symbol anymore, it was a target. It had been weeks since I'd seen him. Since the day I walked out of our parents' house and left their justifications in the dust, I hadn't had to look him in the face. But that didn't mean I wasn't watching. Maplebrook wasn't far. And neither was the internet. I had a separate folder filled with social media screenshots, Jenna's filtered photos of their dream home, their engagement announcement in front of the wraparound porch, Mason holding up a paint roller like he was building a dynasty. It all looked so stable. But now I knew better. According to the records Gwen had uncovered, the mortgage Mason signed was a lie from the first signature. It wasn't just a parent gifting a down payment, it was a complete fabrication. They had listed the $130,000 as a family asset contribution with no legal ownership attachments. But the account it came from? That was in my name. And I had never once been informed, let alone consented. Fraudulent mortgage applications weren't just technical errors, they were legal landmines. Roy called me 2 days later. "Bridgemont is freezing the mortgage," he said. "Their legal team got the preliminary filings. Your name being attached to the source of the down payment without proper documentation? It's enough to stall everything." "What does that mean, exactly?" I asked, even though I already knew. I just wanted to hear it out loud. "They're putting the loan on hold. If they find the application was misleading, and they'll nullify the agreement. Mason could lose the house." I didn't say anything for a long moment. "Cass," Roy said quietly, "you okay?" I didn't know how to answer that. I wasn't gloating. There wasn't any joy in watching his castle shake. There was just a strange hollowness. A detachment. Like watching a tower topple in slow motion and wondering why it ever stood in the first place. He had taken something sacred. And now it was catching up to him. A week later, I heard the next piece, this time from Gwen. Apparently, Mason's employer, the River Grove City Council, had been contacted by the bank as part of the investigation. A routine inquiry, but it triggered a ripple effect. Someone at HR flagged the situation, and Mason was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending review. That same night, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Mason, did you seriously go this far?" I stared at the screen for a long time. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding, and for a second I imagined what it would feel like to explain it all. To list every injustice, every stolen opportunity, every patronizing pat on the back I'd endured while he got bailed out again and again. But I didn't owe him my words. He'd heard them before and shrugged them off. So I blocked the number. Let him feel, for once, what it was like to be unheard. I heard from Jenna 2 days later. Or rather, I heard about her. Through a mutual acquaintance from high school who still followed both of us online. She told me there had been an argument. Loud, public, messy, on the front lawn of that perfect Maplebrook house. Neighbors watched. Someone called the cops. No arrests, but plenty of yelling. Something about fraud and, how could you not tell me, and you've ruined everything. Jenna hadn't posted since. The cracks were spreading fast. I didn't reach out. I didn't snoop. I didn't call our parents to ask how they were handling it. Because the truth was, I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing to fix the mess, to mediate, to pretend like everything could still be patched over. I was standing still, letting the consequences breathe. They'd built that house with stolen bricks. They called it a fresh start, a new chapter, a dream come true. But it was never theirs to build. Not like that. And I wasn't going to lift a single finger to keep it standing. Roy updated me almost daily now. The case was gaining traction. The judge had approved the hearing date. Gwen's documentation was being reviewed by an expert witness. Our attorney, Evan, said the evidence was so airtight it could suffocate. But still, I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. I felt steady. Calm in a way that made me wonder how long I'd been holding my breath. For years, maybe. Always bracing for disappointment, always watching Mason receive grace after grace while I worked and waited and worked some more. But now? Now I had stopped waiting. The night before the hearing date was set, I walked to the edge of Lake Astoria just before sunset. The air was cool and quiet. I stood by the water, wrapped in a hoodie, and watched the sky turn shades of amber and plum. It reminded me of Pine Hollow, the farm, the way Grandma Judith used to hum while canning peaches, how Grandpa Warren always pointed out the colors in the sky like they were notes in a song only he could hear. They would have hated this, seeing what their daughter had done. But I think they'd be proud of me, not just for fighting, but for refusing to become like the people who took from me, for staying rooted in the truth. That house in Maplebrook may have had 4 bedrooms and a manicured lawn, but it was never built to last. Not when the foundation was theft. Not when the blueprints were drawn in silence and secrecy. Let it crumble. I had a different kind of home to build. One based on truth. One no one could take from me again. I'd never been inside Fairhaven County Court before, but I'd always imagined it would feel sterile, cold marble floors, humming fluorescent lights, the kind of space designed to make you feel small. I wasn't wrong. But I hadn't expected the quiet dignity of it either, the way everything moved with such deliberate gravity. Nothing rushed. Nothing forgotten. Every step, every word carried weight. I wore a navy blazer and black slacks, simple, sharp, armor in fabric form. Roy met me outside, dressed in his usual charcoal gray suit that probably hadn't changed in style since the 90s, but still managed to command attention. Gwen and Evan were already inside, briefing the clerk and double-checking the evidence files one last time. "You ready?" Roy asked, handing me a cup of black coffee. I nodded, though my hands trembled around the cup. "I don't know if ready is the right word. But I'm here." "That's enough," he said. "Let the truth do the heavy lifting today." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Rows of pew-like benches, a few scattered attendees, the hum of whispered voices. Darlene and Glenn sat at the defendant's table, both dressed for sympathy, Darlene in a pale blue cardigan, pearls, and a look of artificial fragility, Glenn in a suit that looked like it had been borrowed from someone else. He couldn't meet my eyes. Darlene did. Just once. Her expression was flat, unreadable, like she was trying to pretend I wasn't real. Mason wasn't there. Neither was Jenna. Maybe that was for the best. The judge, a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and a sharp gaze, entered, and the room stood. As we all sat again, I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. This was it. This was where everything unraveled. Or everything began. Evan opened with our case. Calm, steady, confident. He didn't dramatize it, he didn't need to. The facts were enough. He presented a clear timeline, the creation of the Education Trust by Warren and Judith Lane, the designation of Cassidy Lane as sole beneficiary, and the clear legal stipulation that no disbursements were to be made without her written consent. Then he moved into the financial forensics, Gwen's meticulous records that showed the quiet siphoning of funds from Grandma Judith's accounts, the ultimate $130,000 withdrawal, and the fraudulent mortgage documentation listing the money as a family contribution. Darlene and Glenn's attorney, a pale man with a nasal voice and a folder full of excuses, tried to deflect. He argued that the money had always been intended for family use, that the lines were blurry, that the parents had acted in good faith for the collective betterment of the family. The judge didn't blink. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, walking to the witness stand, each step echoing against the tiled floor. I took the oath, my voice calm despite the riot inside my chest, and sat down, gripping the edge of the seat. Evan guided me gently. He let me tell the story in my own words, how Warren and Judith had told me about the fund, how I'd never touched a cent of it through college, how my parents insisted it was still there, and how I only learned the truth after being accepted to grad school. How did you feel when you learned the money was gone? Evan asked. Shocked, I said, my throat tightening. Betrayed. Not just because of the money, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just a fund. It was a promise. A legacy. My grandparents worked their whole lives to make that possible, and my parents gave it away like it was spare change. Evan gave me a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Cassidy. Then it was the other attorney's turn. He tried to rattle me. Asked if I'd ever seen a signed document that said the money was only for me. I pointed to the clause in the trust, already admitted into evidence. He asked if I had ever directly told my parents not to use the money for Mason. I told him I never thought I had to. The fund was mine. That should have been enough. He backed down quickly. By the time I stepped down, I could feel the tide turning. Darlene and Glenn looked pale, brittle. I saw Darlene lean toward her attorney, whispering furiously. Glenn sat stiffly, jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the judge and the floor. Roy gave me a nod, small and proud. The judge called a recess. When we returned, she didn't waste time. She began by summarizing the facts, how the defendants had been entrusted with a legal fiduciary responsibility, how they had diverted funds without consent, how their actions directly violated the terms of the Education Trust. Her voice was calm, but every word cut clean. Precise. This court finds the defendants, Darlene and Glenn Lane, guilty of inheritance mismanagement and financial misconduct, she said. They are hereby ordered to repay the full sum of $130,000 to the plaintiff, Cassidy Lane, with accrued interest totaling $18,400. Darlene gasped. Glenn's head dropped. I didn't move. I just stared straight ahead, my pulse thundering in my ears. The court further orders penalties under federal education fund fraud statutes, the judge continued, including restitution, and a formal referral to Bridgemont Bank and federal agencies for mortgage fraud investigation. The property obtained through said fund, namely the residence in Maplebrook registered to Mason Lane, will be frozen pending review and may be seized as part of civil recovery. I closed my eyes for one breath. One long, deep breath. It was done. Not vengeance. Not vindictiveness. Just truth. Plain, undeniable, legally binding truth. As the courtroom emptied, I felt Roy's hand on my shoulder. You did it, kid, he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. No, I said, turning to him. We did. Outside, the sunlight hit my face like a blessing. I inhaled the crisp fall air, grounding myself in it. There were no fireworks, no cheering crowds, no dramatic music swelling in the background. Just peace. Earned peace. They'd taken what they could. But they hadn't taken me. Not my voice, not my future, and certainly not my fire. The storm was over. Now came the rebuilding. And this time, the foundation was mine. I moved in on a rainy Tuesday. It wasn't poetic. There were no rays of golden sunlight breaking through clouds, no birdsong or fanfare, just a dull gray sky and the steady thrum of rain against the windshield as I pulled into the underground garage. But I didn't care. Because as I stepped out of my car and looked up at the sleek glass exterior of the high-rise on Lake Astoria, I felt something real. Not excitement, exactly. Not joy. It was deeper than that. Steadier. Peace. The apartment was on the 23rd floor, tucked in the northeast corner. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by clean, minimalist hallways and the faint smell of lavender from someone's distant diffuser. My new sanctuary. My space. The first thing I did after unlocking the door was step onto the balcony. Even with the drizzle misting my face, I stood there for several minutes, gripping the railing and staring out at the expanse of water. Lake Astoria stretched far and wide, framed by the silhouette of city towers in the distance and the soft blur of shoreline trees. I could hear the echo of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. I had grown up surrounded by people who told me what I could and couldn't do, who decided, time and again, that my needs came second. That Mason's stumbles were more urgent than my success. That quiet meant compliant. That competence meant I didn't need care. But up here, with wind threading through my hair and a horizon that belonged only to me, all of that fell away. No more second place. The apartment itself was modest by city standards. Open-concept kitchen and living room, 2 bedrooms, a tiny office nook, but it was mine. Paid for with the settlement money, the court-mandated restitution, and a significant fellowship awarded to me just 2 weeks after the verdict. I'd applied for the Orion Fellowship on a whim during the chaos of the legal fight. It was offered by a nonprofit consulting firm that specialized in policy development and ethical governance. The application had asked for a personal essay on the meaning of accountability in leadership. I'd written it in one sitting, my fingers flying across the keys, pouring my experience onto the page not as a sob story, but as a blueprint, how truth doesn't just set you free, it sets a standard. They called me for an interview 3 days later, offered the position the following week. So now, each morning, I walked 15 minutes through downtown, coffee in hand, past the Monument Fountain and the corner bookstore, and into an office where I was respected, where my voice mattered. No more shrinking. No more asking for space that was rightfully mine. I'd blocked my parents' numbers. Glenn had tried calling twice, once from the house phone and once from a private line. I didn't answer either time. Darlene sent a single email after the judgment, thick with guilt and denial, asking if I was proud of tearing the family apart. I deleted it without replying. I hadn't torn anything. I just stopped holding it together by myself. Mason hadn't reached out. Maybe he was too embarrassed, or maybe he finally understood the weight of what he'd taken. I didn't hate him, but I didn't forgive him either. Not yet. Maybe not ever. There was no family to mend, not in the traditional sense. But I wasn't grieving it. That old version of family had required me to disappear in order for it to function. That was never family. That was performance. And I was done performing. I spent the first weekend in my new place putting up bookshelves and filling them with every volume I'd ever loved. I hung a corkboard in the office, like the one I'd had in my old apartment, only this one was covered not with deadlines and borrowed dreams, but with new ones, personal goals, projects I wanted to pitch at Orion. Ideas for a potential policy paper about fiduciary ethics and family financial abuse. Because I knew now I wasn't the only one this had happened to. And maybe, just maybe, my voice could help others find theirs. That night, I curled up on the couch, a blanket around my shoulders and a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. The rain had stopped. Through the wall of windows, I could see the lake shimmering under the moonlight, the city lights flickering like 1,000 distant stars. I didn't cry. Not anymore. That part of me, the part that wept over lost trust, broken promises, and family wounds, had made peace with the silence. I'd grieved that girl, held her in the storm, and now I was stepping forward as the woman she'd fought to become. I was not defined by what they did to me. I was defined by how I rose after. A knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. My hand hovered over the knob for a moment before I opened it to find the building's front desk concierge holding a small package. "Delivery for you, Ms. Lane," he said, smiling politely. I signed for it and closed the door. The package was small, wrapped in simple brown paper with a handwritten label. No return address. I opened it cautiously and found a thin box. Inside was a folded letter and a necklace, delicate silver with a pendant shaped like an open book. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Judith's. "Cassidy, if you're reading this, then I'm not there to see you chase your dreams, but I'm watching wherever I am. This belonged to my grandmother, and now it belongs to you. Let it remind you that stories are sacred, especially the ones you write yourself. I always knew you'd tell yours, no matter what tried to stop you. Love always. Grandma Judith." I held the necklace in my palm, breath caught in my throat. A legacy intact. Not in the money. Not in the trust or the courtroom victories. But in this quiet confirmation that I had been seen. Chosen. Loved. I clasped the necklace around my neck and looked out at the water again. Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's what rises when you refuse to be broken by it. And here, in this apartment with a view, I'd finally found mine. The final chapter didn't begin with a dramatic phone call or another confrontation. It began with an email. Simple subject line: Eastmont University Award notification. I almost didn't open it. I was in the middle of drafting a report on ethical accountability frameworks for municipal leaders and had buried myself in work for the last few days, craving the clarity that came with purpose. But when I saw the school's name, my chest tightened. I clicked. "Dear Ms. Lane, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the recipient of the Eastmont University Scholarship for Academic Integrity and Perseverance, awarded annually to a student who has demonstrated exceptional moral courage, resilience, and a commitment to the pursuit of education against unjust odds. The scholarship includes full tuition and housing for the duration of your program, beginning fall semester. Congratulations." I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as the words blurred. This wasn't just a scholarship. This was an acknowledgement. A validation that everything I'd survived, everything I'd fought for had meaning. Not just to me, not just in courtrooms and late-night emails, but in the eyes of others who saw past the pain and into the substance of what had been built from it. I printed the letter and tacked it to my corkboard, right next to the pendant from Judith's necklace and a sticky note that said, "Keep your light." My grandmother's words, now a mantra. From the living room window, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, cars weaving down the streets below, lights flickering in office buildings, and across Lake Astoria, the faint silhouette of the university campus glimmering with promise. My future was no longer a maybe. It was real, solid, mine. The next morning, the final cracks in the Lane facade came tumbling down. I didn't seek them out, but news travels quickly in small suburban circles. The local news ran a short segment on the civil settlement from the Education Fund case, and within days, the fallout spread through Ashbury Heights like wildfire. Mason lost his job with the River Grove City Council permanently, not suspended, not reassigned, but terminated after the internal review found discrepancies in his mortgage disclosures that he hadn't reported to HR. He was deemed a liability. His benefits were frozen. His career in public service? Over. The house in Maplebrook didn't last much longer. Without his job and with the mortgage frozen due to the fraudulent financial documentation, Bridgemont Bank seized the property. I saw the listing online. Foreclosure. Property to be auctioned. The pictures Jenna once posted so proudly were now attached to a cold bank-owned property record. I heard she left him. And honestly, I felt nothing. Darlene stepped down from her position on the Ashbury Community Board the following week, after several members called for a vote of no confidence. The buzzwords were breach of public trust and questionable financial ethics, but I knew what it really was. People realizing that for all of her charm and composure, she had built her social standing on lies. Glenn's reputation took a quieter hit. His law firm never made a public statement, but he was quietly removed from any high-profile cases and shuffled into a back office. No more client-facing meetings. Just a name on paper, fading. They had spent decades constructing an image, a picture-perfect family, a golden son, two well-off parents, a bright daughter tucked in the background, and now the frame was empty. I didn't have to tear it down. They did it to themselves. I was no longer in the picture, and that was the greatest freedom I could have imagined. One afternoon in early May, I walked through the campus at Eastmont, holding the acceptance packet in my hand. Students were scattered across the green, reading, laughing, planning futures without stolen dreams. I found a bench under a row of cherry blossoms, let the petals drift around me, and opened the folder. Course offerings. Academic advisor contact. Fellowship information. Everything laid out like a runway, ready for takeoff. A voice inside me whispered, "You did this. You built this. They don't get to write it." And they wouldn't. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the court ruling, and I didn't plan to. For years, I had tried to earn their recognition, tried to be enough for them to see me, not just as the smart one, not just as the daughter who never needed help, but as a person with her own worth, her own place in the world. But now I realized I didn't need their eyes on me anymore. I didn't need their approval. I had mine, and it was enough. That night, back in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The lights over Lake Astoria glimmered like fireflies in the dark, a city alive with movement and new beginnings. I thought about everything that had been lost and what had been found in its place. I had found strength and truth, power in my voice, a future built not on handouts, but on the resilience I'd sharpened through years of being told to figure it out. Judith and Warren had planted seeds, and yes, others tried to uproot them, but I had replanted. I had watered them with tenacity, and now they were blooming. I sipped my wine and let the silence wrap around me, not the silence of being ignored, but the kind that comes after a storm, when the air is still and clean and everything feels new. Tomorrow, I'd start building again. Books to read, cases to study, policies to draft. But tonight, I let myself feel the full weight of what had shifted. This was my legacy now, and no one else would ever write my story.